All right. So we are studying the Queen of Sheba, we're moving on to the Queen of Sheba. We finished up our study last week on Joseph, the husband of Mary, and as has been our kind of routine, we go from New Testament to Old Testament back to New Testament, except for this time, after the Queen of Sheba, we're going to look at Solomon, given the fact that the Queen of Sheba is kind of a part of the account of Solomon. So right after the Queen of Sheba, we're going to move into Solomon after that, and I'll have those notes ready for next week. But for now, we have the Queen of Sheba, who is referred to in Matthew chapter 12 and Luke chapter 11, which we'll look at here in just a minute. Jesus refers to her as the Queen of the South. And as this map shows, we've got Canaan, or where Israel is, up in here. And then all the way down here in the south is the land of Sheba, or Obal. It's kind of this part right here at the tip of the Arabian desert is considered the region of Sheba. It's about 2,000 miles from that southern tip up to Canaan, regardless of how you go, whether you take the Red Sea and then take the channels into Israel, or you go by land, it's still about the same distance and about the same amount of time as well. Very long, especially, even today, it takes us 22 hours to get from here to South Carolina, which is 1,250 miles. So 2,000 miles, that's even in a car, that would take 35 or 40 hours. So you got to figure that taking a trip back in Solomon's day, that would have taken a whole lot longer. So this is an undertaking, to say the least. She gave Solomon, according to 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 10 through 11, she gave him $204 million worth of gold, along with other valuables. It's $204 million worth. That's based on current day. 1 talent equals 75 pounds, and I think it was 120 talents. So that's a lot. That's a lot of gold. So you got to figure the caravan size to take. Think about 75 pounds of gold and how heavy that probably was. I didn't look up how heavy that would be. Times 120. Okay, that's a lot of gold. And then you add to that, in the account of 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 10 through 11, you add to that the spices that she brought, the gemstones that were also a part of that. There was a whole bunch of stuff she brought as tribute to Solomon that certainly would have taken quite a bit of manpower and caravan size to bring 2,000 miles. This was not just a whimsical undertaking. This was a very serious type of journey with a very serious purpose as well. So looking at some of the secular history, there's a whole host of legends about the Queen of Sheba. We are never given her name in the scriptures, and even historical documents aren't sure to which Queen of Sheba it's being referred to. However, Origen, he described this woman as being the subject of the Song of Solomon. That's not necessarily the case, especially given the fact that in the account, she comes, she talks to Solomon, and then she heads back home. There is no record whatsoever of any romantic interaction, and the Song of Solomon records Solomon being married. There's no suggestion that he married the Queen of Sheba, but there's an entire faith system based around a child that came from the union of Solomon and supposedly the Queen of Sheba. In Islamic tradition, she's known as Bilqis, supposedly led a people who worshipped the sun, and Suleiman invited her to learn about Jehovah. Again, this is according to Islamic tradition, not according to the Bible. In Ethiopian tradition, she's known as Makeda. There's this elaborate story which details how Solomon invited her to his palace to seduce her and sired her son, Menelik I, which established a long dynasty. Now, there is such a person as Menelik I who did establish a long dynasty. There is no evidence that says that he was the son of Solomon. However, this in turn leads to the establishment of the Rastafarian belief that Haile Selassie, who lived between 1892 and 1975, was the Messiah of promise, or variations thereof. If you've ever looked up the Rastafarian faith system and belief system, it's based on this fellow Haile Selassie, and the fact that he supposedly was the culmination of the promises that they believed were to be fulfilled in the Messiah, or at least the re-embodiment of the Messiah. So it's kind of an interesting, situation. Again, their belief on that's based on tradition. It's not based on scripture whatsoever. In Josephus' record, she's called Nekul, the ruler of Ethiopia, as well as Egypt, which is part of the reason why some people associate her to the Song of Solomon, and to a certain extent other parts of scripture, because supposedly Solomon married the daughter of the Pharaoh, and between that and the connection to Josephus, people assume, well, maybe the Queen of Sheba was actually the daughter of Pharaoh, and Solomon married her, and then all this happened. Again, there's nothing in scripture about that. So, anything through the facts that we covered or the secular history?
Does history say anything about how she got so rich?
Nope. Nope.
Oil there now.
No. Although it was very rich in gold, very rich in gemstones, and the spices that they had, apparently some of the spices that she brought weren't available, at least at that time, from anywhere else. The scriptures note that no spices had ever come to the kingdom of Israel before, these types of spices had come before Queen of Sheba had come. So they did have exports that were considered luxuries and valuables, so I'm sure that had quite a bit to do. But I mean, just the phrase Queen of Sheba has come to represent great wealth, great luxury. I think it was Bedknobs and Broomsticks, the movie, where somebody references the Queen of Sheba when the little girl's dressed up in all these gemstones and necklaces and so forth. Who are you, the Queen of Sheba? And that's kind of the thought process, is that the Queen of Sheba, she presided over a kingdom that was very wealthy. Now, it wasn't as wealthy as Israel, but and even Sheba was in awe of the wealth and the power of Solomon. And we'll look at that in just a moment. Anything else through that? All right. So there are two parallel accounts. There's one in 2 Chronicles chapter 9 as well as 1 Kings chapter 10. We're going to look at the account in 2 Chronicles, again, nearly verbatim between 2 Chronicles and 1 Kings. But we're going to look at 2 Chronicles chapter 9, starting in verse 1. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, starting in verse 1. Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions, having a very great retinue, camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain it to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. So, again, what must have taken months, probably, for Sheba to, certainly to arrange all of this to start with before she ever even left, to pack up and arrange all this, the logistics of it all, and then to travel to Solomon, she hears about the fame of Solomon. Now, what all was a part of that fame? Well, obviously, what also was included in that fame was his great wisdom, because she comes to Solomon with hard questions, and she talks to him about all that is in her heart. So part of his fame had to do with his great wisdom. Certainly part of his fame had to do with his power and wealth, and perhaps by extension the power and wealth of Israel at that time. So at least to that extent, having heard about the fame of Solomon 2,000 miles south of all of this, she decides she wants to go and talk to him. So when in verse 1, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions. Now, it's interesting because these first 4 verses or so really are about her observation, her purpose in going to Solomon, and her observation of Solomon's responses and Solomon's kingdom. Now, these hard questions, going to our questions on our notes. Question 1, why would the queen bring such an abundance of valuables from her country? She brought, remember what the text said, she brought spices, gold in abundance, precious stones. Then we go to verse 9. She gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great abundance, and precious stones. There never were any spices such as those the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. So why do you suppose she did this? Why would the queen bring such an abundance of valuables from her country?
What she heard about him, that somebody had told her he's a great king and wise and rich. It was a very generous gift of respect
Yeah.
from her. I mean, even our presidents do that in
Mhm.
other countries, show gifts, nothing.
Nothing like quite like that, yeah. Well, absolutely.
So what would be her bankroll if she's got that much to give?
No kidding. No kidding.
I know how much, later on in Chronicles or Kings, it tells how much she gathered in per year,
Yeah.
and it was unbelievable, almost
Well,
$1 billion.
yeah, actually, when you adjust it for today, verse 13, the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. That's something like $2.1 billion. Oh, that's just gold. That's not including, silver or any other precious things. That's just gold. Huh? Oh yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I mean, we're talking again. Solomon was described as the wealthiest king ever, and Israel, at least at that time, was perhaps the wealthiest kingdom in the world. It certainly wasn't the biggest, though. Okay, by no means was Israel the biggest kingdom, but in terms of the whole package, the wealth that existed, the wisdom of Solomon, certainly you could make the case, especially since Jehovah was with them at this time, you could make the case that this kingdom was the most important kingdom in the world at that time. So, yeah.
Do we have a time frame on this? How far back this happened in the life of Solomon, his kingdom?
I did look that up, but I don't remember exactly what the dates on that were. I'll have to let you know.
Certainly want to curry favor and get on this guy's good side, not knowing how world events fall out,
Yeah.
alliances, rise
Well,
and
and trade routes, certainly this would be a very lucrative trade route to establish. But I mean, 2,000 miles, that's a long trade route for sure. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the respect that she's showing Solomon, the kind of, to a certain extent, the reverence towards his, not just his wealth and power, but his wisdom. Because it sounds as though, based on what the text tells us, she came to Jerusalem not to establish necessarily specifically some relations between the kingdoms. She came for what reason? To ask these questions. To ask these questions. That's what it sounds like. And that being the case, when she came to test Solomon with hard questions, she spoke to him, with him, all that was in her heart. It sounds as though this was, and certainly there were, certainly political aspects that could be done. I mean, 2,000 miles, that's going to take a while, and I'm sure she was there for a while. I'm sure this wasn't like a weeks-long visit. But having said that, it sounds as though the main purpose was because she had serious questions she wanted to ask Solomon, the wisest king known to exist at that point. Yes, sir.
I think as Doug suggested, even today, dignitaries visiting, I'm going to give you a crystal vase, you give me a gold platter.
Yeah.
There seemed to have been some expectation, or it was come back then, I'm taking him all this stuff, spices and things like he's never seen. He's going to give me something back.
Sure.
Not that she's just totally turning over
Yeah.
There'd be some other things.
Well, and we even see here in the text later on that in verse 12, King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked him, much more than she had brought to the king. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. So, I mean, if you figure $204 million worth of gold, it doesn't specifically say that Solomon turned around and gave her even more gold necessarily, but, I mean, maybe it was in exchange for things that could only be obtained in that region, maybe wood from Lebanon or, whatever. But the value that was traded here was even more so from Solomon. And that just goes to show, first of all, the great generosity of Solomon, which, again, we'll talk about when we talk more about Solomon. But his generosity, his recognition of the importance of establishing these relations with other kingdoms. Certainly this isn't going to hurt relations in any way. So there's kind of this give and take, which might very well have been customary. Whether or not it was customary for him to give even much more than she brought, I don't know. I would tend to think that probably wasn't customary. Maybe in kind, okay, maybe like value trading, but in terms of giving her even more than she brought to tribute for him, I would tend to think that probably wasn't your common way of doing things, but he did. Of course, he had it. He could do that, and he was generous with it.
The wisdom and the knowledge and the wisdom to use that knowledge he gave her. Somebody gave me the right kind of tip on the.
Well, sure. That's true. That's true.
And what she learned from it, because she just didn't sit down and have a couple of questions.
Right.
She was prepared and quizzed him a bunch.
Oh, sure.
And what he shared with her could have been of so much more value.
Well, and that's a good point. Verse 12, it doesn't specifically say that it was gold and valuable jewelry and gemstones and stuff like that comprised all that he gave her. I'm sure that was part of it too. But it might very well be that verse 12 is also incorporating the answers he gave her. This could be part of what was imparted from Solomon to her. He gave to the queen of Sheba all she desired. Well, part of what she desired were these answers to these hard questions. And he did answer those for her. So it could very well be that that's part of what's being considered here. You can't really you can't quantify, how much is an answer worth to this question in my heart. But even so, it could very well be that that's part of it. For her, it was worth it. Yeah, definitely. For her, it was definitely worth it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
She probably had never met someone probably richer than her.
Could be.
And then when she hears the stories about him, it's one of those things, I gotta check this out.
Yeah.
I gotta find out if this is real, because, like I say, y'all are just, what you just said, there could be a benefit
Yeah.
of this.
Well, and I don't know what the customs were, but I do know at least at a certain point in history, it was uncommon for the leader of a nation or a country to personally visit unless it was an exceedingly important meeting. They would send representatives, they would send diplomats and stuff like that, but a personal face-to-face meeting, especially this length of distance and certainly time that it took, also speaks to the importance that she's placing. She didn't just send a messenger with these questions. She went herself. It sounds as though she was the ruler. That is the assumption. And there's no reference to any kings of Sheba in relation to this queen. There were kings before and after, but in terms of this queen, there's no record of her being married or anything like that. So it could be that she was daughter of the king. Maybe he didn't have any sons, so she took the throne. But there's nothing to suggest that she was married or anything like that. We don't know. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The end of verse 4, different translation, at the very, very end of it, when it says no more spirit in it.
Yep.
The ESV says it took her breath away.
Yeah.
When she saw
Yeah.
what she saw and heard.
And heard and learned.
And experienced, what she experienced.
Right.
There, which is all your senses.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It just took her breath away. And that's got to be, for someone in her statute to say that or to be effective.
In that way, yeah.
Had to be just, and, we can, I don't think we can even imagine
No.
what that was like.
Well, and if you go back and you read what the temple, the first temple, the temple that Solomon built, the amount of gold, the amount of valuable materials that were used in its construction, just what it must have looked like. I mean, there are tons of pictures and drawings and things like that that attempt to try to convey just how majestic this building was and how the wealth that is shown in the building of that temple. And if you consider the fact that certainly the temple had all that wealth, and Solomon focused on that first, and then afterward he built his palace. So you got to figure, I mean, what she's being exposed to, what she's seeing, is wealth beyond measure, especially of that time, and I think probably even in comparison to our time, this is still wealth beyond measure. I mean, this is beyond anything that you and I could probably really put into any type of experience that we've had. And yeah, there was no more spirit in her. She was in awe. It was like this. It was almost like she just kind of just, I don't know what to say. She was speechless. Yeah. Anything else through that? All right. Our next question. What do you suppose were these hard questions she asked Solomon? Obviously, there's no way for us to know, but I put it this way. What is all that is in your heart that you might like to have discussed with Solomon? If you had this opportunity to speak to the wisest man who'd ever lived, to go and talk to him and ask these hard questions, what questions might you ask?
I think some for her would be position of leadership, as he had shown his wisdom in the very first, whose child is this, divide the child, and all that story.
Right.
She's over a nation and have similar decisions to make. How do you run a country?
Right. Likely maybe discussion of laws that had been effective, that worked for the kingdom. I'm sure there was a lot of leadership aspects, political aspects of questions. I'm sure that was probably a part of it.
Maybe even some spiritual nature questions, because you mentioned she's heard about Jehovah.
Yeah.
And then he's going to praise, this God really loves his country, he's put you in, so maybe
Yeah.
what's the spiritual aspect or nature?
Well, and that's part of what we see here in verse 8. Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you, setting you on his throne to be king for the Lord your God. Because your God has loved Israel to establish them forever, therefore he made you king over them to do justice and righteousness. So obviously, if she hadn't heard of Jehovah before this, she has at this point. Okay, she is referring to Yahweh and their God. And she's acknowledging that power that he has and having put Solomon in the position and being with them to do what he's done. And it does make you wonder, I mean, when you think about the phrase here in verse 2, all that was in her heart and these hard questions, I certainly think this was more than just leadership questions, although that certainly has the value, especially being a leader of a nation as she was. I'm sure there must have been maybe life-type questions that she wanted to know. Maybe she asked the age-old question, what's the meaning of life? And of course, we know Solomon knew. What did Solomon say it was in Ecclesiastes? Fear God and keep his commandments. Okay, this is the whole duty of man. That is the meaning of life. What these questions were, I would love to know what it was she asked Solomon and what his responses were. That would just be amazing. But it kind of got me to thinking, if you or I had that opportunity to be able to talk, if we were in, not necessarily Sheba's shoes, but if we had that opportunity to be able to ask Solomon all the questions that are in our heart, what would we ask him? Okay, not that necessarily he has the knowledge of God per se. in the sense that Jesus had the knowledge of God, but he was given the wisdom from God, especially about this life. And there's certainly applications of that wisdom about serving Jehovah, as we see from Proverbs and the Ecclesiastes. So there's a great deal that, if you really sit and think about it, what would I ask the wisest person on the earth at that time? Again, I would say Jesus was wiser, but in terms of a king over a nation, what would I ask? What questions might be on my mind that I would want to know? What's the best way to deal with difficult circumstances? How do I go about handling issues with children or with family? How do I, there might be a ton of different questions if we really sat down to think about it that we would want to ask and hear his take on it. Just that wisdom that he had. Now, granted, he didn't always have that wisdom or didn't always follow his own wisdom. Certainly, the situation with his children ended up breaking the kingdom of Israel into two. He ended up following after false gods due to his many wives. But in terms of at least for certainly a long period of time, there was certainly a lot of valuable information that you could get from Solomon. Just kind of makes you wonder. Roland?
You alluded to, we certainly don't know, but probably reading the book of Ecclesiastes is the answers to the kinds of questions she would have asked.
Sure.
As anyone would have asked.
Yeah. How do you deal with aging? Solomon talks about that in chapter 11 and 12 of Ecclesiastes. There's a lot there that Solomon discusses. Doug?
I would just have to imagine it had to all include God as the center of everything.
Yeah.
And he was so good to acknowledge that
Yeah.
all along that I would think that had to be to the point that she knows all about his God.
Oh, yeah, apparently.
How wonderful his God has been to him and his country and everything. So I would think that conversation couldn't not revolve around God and
What he had done and
wisdom. Where he better not be taking credit for this.
Right.
He's got to give credit to where it's due.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
being honest with her, is impressive with any leader.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Not taking credit, all leaders want to take credit for everything they do.
Yeah. But you would think, and certainly it seems as though Solomon, it was all centered around Jehovah. This is what Jehovah has done. This is what Jehovah has accomplished through me, his servant, that sort of thing. Yeah.
In 1 Kings 10, the first verse talks about now the Queen Sheba heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord.
Yeah.
It was about that.
Yeah.
It says she came to test him with her questions.
Yeah.
So
That association with Jehovah is part of what motivated her to come and ask him those questions. That's a good point. Yep.
To that point,
Which means that she had heard of Jehovah.
a man may not could answer. A man is far away from where she lives.
Right.
Says that this could be something impossible for any normal.
Right.
Not man or woman or human, that he was able to answer it. And
He was the only one who could answer some of these questions, maybe.
I think that's a very good point she's making.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
also, verse 7, 2 Corinthians, it said, how blessed are your men, how blessed are these your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. It's possible she might not have had the respect of her subjects and needed to know more how to deal with them.
That could be.
Being a woman.
That could be. That's a good point. Because a lot of this is her observation of the apparel of his servants and the service of his waiters and the cupbearers. And that certainly wouldn't necessarily be something that I would notice, but maybe another leader would. So that's a good point, that maybe being a woman, and that wasn't a normal thing in the kingdoms at that time, much less even today, to be in that type of a position. So it could be that she was maybe dealing with some respect issues or maybe some hostility or whatnot among her own servants. It could very well be. That's a good point, because a lot of these observations are on that. Yeah. Anything else?
Take a chance just dragging some of your servants
Oh.
2,000 miles up to that place.
Yeah.
They may want to jump ship.
I'm going to his say, yeah, it could be. Yeah. All right, next question. What do you suppose the account means when it says there was no more spirit in her? Doug kind of alluded to this as well. Bewildered, in awe, speechless. ESV has what now, Doug? Took her breath away. Yeah, breathless. So, I mean, I think we can associate, I'm sure at some point in time, there's been some event or something where we've probably been like that, where we just didn't know what to say, in a good way, not necessarily in a bad or sorrowful way, but in a good way. And this is one of those things where you're just kind of just like eyes wide open, like, I just can't believe what I'm seeing. Now, just a random person coming in and hearing all the wisdom of Solomon and seeing all of what she's seeing, that would accomplish that same thing. But for the Queen of Sheba to be shocked in this way, to be taken and awestruck in this way, certainly speaks even more so to the wealth, the power, the wisdom that Solomon has. And it's hard to fathom just what this must have been like for her, when certainly we would have been in that position, but she's coming from a place of wealth, and she's seeing something that even takes her breath away. Yeah.
Because she went in thinking she knew. I mean, all these sayings, this wisdom, I heard about 2,000 miles away in my country.
Right.
So I thought I knew or had a grasp. Now I get here and it's blown me away.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point to make, because what we see in the account, verse 5, she said, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe their words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half of the greatness of your wisdom was not told to me. You exceed the fame of which I heard." So even the reputation that preceded you didn't do justice to the truth. And to me, that's amazing. Usually it works the other way around. Usually somebody's reputation, it gets built up to the point where maybe it outshines the truth. But in this case, the truth didn't even come or the reputation and the words that she was hearing didn't come close to actually describing the power, the wealth, the wisdom that Solomon is overseeing in Israel. And to me, that's an amazing statement from somebody saying, "Listen, I've heard." In fact, what she had heard inspired her to travel 2,000 miles. And then she says, "Now that I see and observe this, it didn't even come close." You outshine even your reputation and your fame. She is. She's very. Now that's a good word. She's very humbled by all of this, and I think you definitely see that response from her, that she's very humbled by what she's seeing, which might very well be saying something given where she's coming from. Doug, sorry, Dwayne.
That's worth $240 million.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That being certainly for a leader to be humbled and to recognize, Jehovah and all that, that's definitely worth $204 million.
I just think that what we could experience today probably would influence maybe God's creation.
Yeah.
To see a sunrise or a sunset that just, there's no two alike.
Yeah.
And to see the beauty of what God has created for us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not for him. He don't need that. He made it for us.
Right.
To see his glory.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting though that she says she didn't believe, but she sure acted like she believed.
Yeah.
And she traveled all that way and brought all these possessions. And Jesus references her as faithful, as was driven by her faith to go see what he had.
Yeah.
It was that skepticism that drove her to go see for herself. And that's what, Jesus admired in her.
Yeah.
And he admires the people, in his own time. That's what he was condemning the people that were right there for not recognizing his wisdom.
Right. Well, and that's interesting that you say that, Seth, because verse 1 says she tested Solomon. Okay, so she heard about the fame and she says, I can't believe he's that wise. Okay, maybe he is wise, maybe he is wealthy, but he can't possibly be as wise as what I'm hearing. So when she goes, she tests him, and notice it starts out testing him with these hard questions. And then in verse 2, he answers all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for her to explain. She comes to the realization he really is not just as wise as what I heard, even more so than what I heard. Didn't even come close. And that's a good point, Seth, because she says, I did not believe the words. Well, she believed to a point that, yeah, he must have some wisdom. I mean, to have this fame and this reputation, he must have some wisdom to put all the logistics together, to take this great journey. Obviously, there was some part of her that was convinced maybe he has some answers, but I don't believe everything I'm hearing. And so I'm going to put it to the test and see if this really is true. And like you said, as Jesus said, she went to the, quote, ends of the earth to hear the words of Solomon. And
She had a need for these words for some reason.
there was certainly something about it that she needed. Again, I'm sure there were some political leadership type questions, but it makes you wonder as a human being, the purpose of life, what's the best way to handle life situation. I'm sure that there were some of those questions as well, because you don't travel 2,000 miles today to ask somebody questions for something that you could just send an email for. Okay, she could have just sent messengers. She didn't do that. She went personally. Joe?
What alone, down in 23 and 24, all the kings of the earth came and did the same thing.
Yeah.
Brought him money, but wanted to hear
Yeah,
the knowledge and wisdom.
that's right. Yeah, she wasn't the only one who did this. That's right.
They were a nation that you-
They were a nation that was envied. Yeah, Doug.
I wonder if she thought, when she realized she didn't know the half, if she thought, I didn't bring enough.
I should have brought a whole lot more.
She brought
A
a
lot.
tremendous amount.
Yeah.
If she realized, I didn't even know half,
Yeah.
could have brought more.
Yeah, could be. Yeah. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up where we are with the Queen of Sheba next week, and then we'll move into Solomon. As I said, I'll have those notes on Sunday for everybody. Thank you, everybody.